So, as Mara said, my name is Tara Connolly, and I work for Reed. I have the absolute privilege of working for Reed. I am a cisgen woman who is Caucasian. I have blue hair that kind of comes down in a wisp, and yes, indeed, it is intentional. I'm wearing funky glasses today, and I kind of duded up for you with the jacket today. So I'm really, really happy to be moderating this town hall today because you've had a few days of reflection, some learnings. Hopefully you've got something new out of it as well. And this is our opportunity to reflect a little bit on that. I'm also I'm assuming that there was probably a land acknowledgement that was done today, as we are usually doing. And I wanted to just sort of reiterate that for myself, because I tend to do that when I'm presenting, to just acknowledge that, you know, my work takes place on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And so for me, the idea of doing these land acknowledgements are sort of a first piece, but they're not the only piece, and that it's through my own actions that we're going to support that more inclusive society. So I just wanted to kind of reiterate that for myself as well. And I appreciate being here today. Excited to hear from the audience as well. And as Moira pointed out, there is going to be a possibility for you to participate. The way we've set it up for today is we've created some questions that were sent out to conference participants early on. So you may have had an opportunity to answer some of those, but you were also very welcome to provide your reflections and your thoughts today as well. What I'm going to do is summarize some of the things we heard. I'll probably add in a few of my own reflections as well and riff off of what you have offered. And then after we've gone through the 4 questions, I'll open it up to the floor, so to speak, so that people can think about that while we're reviewing the summaries. Please feel free to put any questions or comments down in the feed loop chat as well as I'm going along, and then we'll take those up through the remainder of our time together. So for me, I'll just be really transparent that my lens on this is to sort of speak about the opportunities and the learnings and the innovations that have definitely come out in parallel to the absolute devastation that's happened with the pandemic. And those things have been in parallel. And so for me, the lens is, how do we continue the momentum on the really potentially positive things, particularly around what we're speaking about today in accessibility? And then also the question is, but what do we need to remain mindful of? So that's going to be the lens I take on all of these questions. So my colleague Julie is here as well, and she's supporting me by putting up some of the questions so that we can review those, and I can give you a bit of information about what you reported back to us as well. So the first question was that we posed was, what are some of the types of adaptive and assistive technologies that you've implemented and or had the opportunity to experience that were not utilized in your work or learning environments before COVID occurred? So some of the things that were pointed out were very concrete examples, such as increased use of Zoom. That's a major one. I think many people are familiar with now. I believe zooming, Zoom bombing, there's like new nouns, new verbs. That's when you know something's been fairly integrated or used within a particular culture, is when those words start to emerge. Captioning has been another thing that has been increased in use. Voice to text has been something else that was mentioned. Increased access to professional development, remotely in particular, and for remote settings and rural settings. And then also the increased use of note-taking supports. Those were some of the things that were talked about as what's sort of newer on the scene. And I think it's really important to recognize that these things are not new, however, and I'm sure many of you in the audience also recognize that it's important for us to be giving credit where credit is due. These innovations come out of disability community. And but now they are being taken up on a much grander scale. And I think that through these next few questions, we can take some time to consider how that is beneficial, and also what we need to consider on an ongoing basis as well, because not everything is all beneficial all the time. And so what do we need to do in terms of universal learning design? What does it mean for hybrid work environments? What does it mean for new and emerging challenges and barriers potentially with these technologies? So that's the first question. That's really what people mostly put forward. And if you're thinking of some other things that have been used that were never used before, please feel free to put those in the chat or keep them in mind for yourself, and feel free to let us know when we open up the floor as well. So Julie, I'll get you to switch to question number 2. Great. So question number 2 was, in what ways have you experienced inclusivity in your workplace and or learning environments as a result of the integration or enhancement of adaptive and assistive technologies? So what's working well? What are some barriers that you've faced potentially? And that's again around the inclusivity of the use of these things. So you've had a lot to say about this, and I've also themed some of it for you in some reflections. So certainly the idea of being able to work from home and work a bit more flexibly was brought up as something that allowed more inclusivity in the workplace, or certainly access and flexibility with the workplace. Increased reach of even the idea of people being able to take professional development that they might have not been able to access in another sort of format due to travel restrictions or finances, any of those things. So there's a little bit more reach around that. The idea as well that there's more access to the information. So things are being recorded. Captioning is available to be used on Zoom. You know, there's greater or lesser degrees of in some of the captionings that are being used, but even that's being tweaked, where there's a space where people can speak about this now and say, hey, the captioning is great, or, oh, let's look at what's happening with the captioning. The fact that it can even be brought up and it's in a full environment discussion is a really big step that's been acknowledged by a lot of people. I would say there's also the idea of being able to work from home is something that is equated to wellness to a certain degree as well. So certainly we know that from the perspective of the pandemic occurring. So for certain people, that was, it's an essential piece to be in the home. For others, it was the way the work kind of flowed. And yet for others, we know in society, they were actually frontline workers, and it wasn't necessarily as much of an option to work from home. But there was all these different types of work environments, and what this did was bust some myths that we know have been out there for a long time, that work from home is pretty impossible, it's a big ask, it's someone's not going to be productive, all of those sort of mythologies, that was turned over and looked at in a very different way. So that was definitely a potentially very positive outcome. However, what we need to consider is also making sure that as we shift over to, say, a hybrid environment, that's going to look different once again. That's not necessarily going to be most people working from home. That could be a mix, or it might be waves of workers in alternating times, some at home, some not. And we definitely heard from you that there was concern that that be done in an even sort of way, that we don't revert back to the idea of someone who's coming in from home, from virtual home, gets othered through that. And what you mentioned was essentially universal design for learning, which is make sure that we've got the systems in place and it's designed well so that everybody can still connect in from home, regardless of how much they're doing that, whether it's once a week, whether it's all week, it doesn't matter. It's that it has to work well and be seamless so that we can support that connection and feeling of team, because that's very important. Someone else also mentioned that AI has been very supportive to family members. So perhaps it's not someone who themselves has a lived experience of disability and navigating barriers, but may actually have family members at home, in which it's incredibly important that they have the flexibility to work from home in order to support at different times. And that actually was equated with continued sense of wellness and supportive mental health. So that was another piece that was brought up around inclusivity. I'd also like to bring up the point that while we're seeing an increase potentially of accessibility in terms of accessibility of information and connecting with the work environment for our work tasks, I think there's still consideration to be held that accessibility doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be inclusive, right? So access to that information in those work tasks doesn't necessarily mean that the workplace is inclusive. And by that, I'm drawing on some of the comments that were made around being able to access the work environment, but can I be included in different conversations, or how well will that go? And even thinking about people's socioeconomic standing, where they live. If they're in a rural environment, do they have the technology and the access they need to actually do that? So all of those considerations are very important, because while we may be improving on that integrating assistive tech to achieve work items and goals, I think we still need to be considering those pieces that are incredibly important aspects of work, such as retreats, professional development, certainly, those sort of organization socials that occur, whether that's an end of year or a holiday, or whatever that is socially that's occurring, that those things also be designed to be accessible from an assistive tech and assistive support lens. Lunch gatherings, any of those things in the hybrid environment are actually going to be very important. And we know that, that's incredibly important for our development and our connection to our workplaces. And it's often at those settings where informal communications are happening that are deeply important to keep us networked and in the know, and even just feeling like we have a good sense of our environment. So that's another thing that came up from 2. So Julie, I'll get you to move on to question 3 for us. Great. So this was a question that asked, if you're an employer, educator, or trainer, please let us know about one inclusive practice involving the integration or enhancement of the use of adaptive or assistive technology that you feel has had a positive impact on your employees or students over the past year. So people certainly spoke about captioning as being something that's very, very important. And as we know, this is one that is not only important for potentially processing and allowing people the time to process, it's also a really good way that people can look back and connect and re-reference what has been said to be able to locate themselves within discussions. It gives just another layer of information coming in. It's just good practice. And it's been one that I think a lot of folks who traditionally might not have felt they needed that piece, and would probably have been, there's people who need things and there's people who don't need things, as opposed to the discussion where we all need something somewhere. It's really allowed, captioning has really allowed people to say, like, wow, that's really helpful in so many ways. And so I think it's a good thing to leverage for us when we talk about universal design and helping people understand those concepts, where a practice can be helpful for all and doesn't have to be something that's othering or requested. Making those things available really does support the environment in a fulsome way. We wanted to ask as well, in addition to this question, is what's the next thing you might want to integrate moving forward? Perhaps if you haven't tried, you've heard a lot through these last few days. Is there something that you're thinking about that you might like to integrate really in the next little while that you think would be helpful in regards to training, and even just including folks to a more fulsome degree in the professional development that maybe you're offering? And I'll go on to question 4 as well, and then we can start chatting a bit. So question 4 was, what are the opportunities that you see that may emerge in the new normal as a result of the integration of more adaptive and assistive technologies in the workplace and or in the learning environments? So what are some potential barriers that we need to continue to be mindful of? So this is a really important one, and certainly from the perspective of the READ initiative, it's something we think about a lot, because there are always opportunities that emerge, and you want to be mindful of, as we go forward, that inclusivity is an important concept to keep in mind. So some examples of this might be there's more screen time, and the screen has allowed us to access things that we couldn't in the physical spaces. However, the screen time may have effects for certain people as well. When we talk about traumatic brain injury, concussions, even for folks who have neural, like, you know, we can talk about headaches. We can talk about folks who have the wiring where it's getting a lot for them to be on screen. Those are really important pieces. We've also heard from some folks in community. There's students on the spectrum have said that, you know, it can be tough even to navigate the idea that now my space is revealed to others, right? And so giving people both choices and options around what it means to be engaging virtually, and is there a one way to do that or not? So even flexibility within the tools that help us stay flexible is important. That I think in the increase in access, we need to remain vigilant about certain practices that keep our workplaces and our learning spaces inclusive. So that means making sure that we have inclusive leadership to support that continual culture shift. And that it's not just about making sure captioning is available or one can work from home, but it's to actually keep that understanding that folks with lived experience are valued. They're an integral part to the workplace. They're actually impossible not to have. That's where I want to see that space going. And so that it moves in tandem. We have these assistive tech does help us. These assistive technologies help us to create that inclusivity, but it's also, they mustn't be the only thing we rely on to make sure there's an inclusive environment. Also, I think something new that's come up for us is that there's an incredible amount of effort and work that goes into navigating environments, whether that's the physical, the social environment, the virtual spaces that we've started to learn from. All of that has begun to be much more acknowledged. I think one of the panelists, Sam, had mentioned that as well too. And so it's really important that we continue to leverage this to create that culture shift, because people are starting to realize, oh, right, there are unwritten rules, social rules that occur in the workspace. And I've had to relearn those because now our workspace has shifted slightly. So being able to leverage that awareness and move it into action is, I think, a really important possibility that we need to remain mindful of. People have talked about how there's the increase in text, emails, all those kind of things that have come with the change to Zoom. So while we've had these technologies that have allowed us to continue on work and access work in very different and flexible ways, which is awesome, they've also meant a difference in how information is coming into us. And so for those with, for instance, executive functioning challenges, that might be a bigger ask that is now needing to be adjusted to for individuals. There's a loss of that organic chance. I'll certainly speak for myself, that organic chance to just check 3 things off my list at once when I kind of see a colleague and I say, oh yes, I got that. And by the way, and I ask a quick question and there's 3 things off. Now those are 3 emails that I need to attend to. And that's a very different type of interaction with our work. So continually being mindful of what these changes are meaning for people as we go forward. A few other things coming up from question 4, the idea of better access to that training and development is really an important aspect for people's continual development along the employment pathway. But it's also to make sure that we're, again, infusing it with technologies that are going to support it, right? So it's one thing to be able to access something through Zoom, for instance, but are the rest of the pieces accessible? And are we using different accessible tools to convey the content and to support people? So what are the platforms we're using? All of those types of questions have come up. So I think that I'll leave it at that for now and see what people want to add in. So I invite you to kind of think about the things I've presented. Some of it's my own riffing off of what you've said, and some of it are, one thing that I noted is that the social is very important. There were a lot of comments that said, love some of the changes, really like the innovations, concerned that as we shift again into hybrid work environments or learning environments, that again, some of that the importance of that social piece will be lost, either to the idea that anything can now happen virtually, now that we've busted that myth slightly, and that will be relied on too heavily, and we won't prioritize some of the other ways that people can connect. Oh, and I'll add one more thing in that someone mentioned about the education and training piece, which I think was an incredibly valuable comment as well, which was that particularly for students, but this can apply to any employee, when we're accessing training and perhaps a coaching or learning how to do something, it allows us to record these sessions so we can refer back to them. So if you were to give me, even if I was working with a mentor, I might be able to then go back to that session, re-engage with it and continue my learning on. So there's certainly some valuable pieces to that. And if I have any challenges with the travel or getting there or the timing, it's really a much more flexible option for me. However, there are still some challenges, right? So for instance, voice recognition becomes sometimes a little tougher to get those profiles set up when we're talking about sort of that engagement online. So there's always going to be pieces that are challenging and that we're going to continue to tweak and look at. So I now offer if there's anyone who wants to comment. I know that Julie's going to be checking the chat to see if anything's come through, and I invite you to make your comments and questions. I see a hand up already, but I'm going to defer to Julie, who's taking care of seeing what's come in when. If she knows I can go very rogue, so we're going to, and it is the afternoon, so it's always a potential.
So I love that you can see a hand because I can't. So I would just say, whoever's got their hand up.
Okay, well, I do see Kathy Malcolm Edwards has a hand up. I will note that I can only see 5 people in that strand right now. So if you're outside of the strand, I apologize.
And one of them is me. So for that, I am grateful. Hello, everyone. As Tara said, Kathy Malcolm Edwards. I identify as having visible and non-visible disabilities, and I have longer hair than ever had in well, at least the last almost 10 years, and it's a mess right now, but that's me. So Tara, there was something that I was reacting to in the last piece you were talking about, because I am one who has, for many reasons, benefited from I'll say the stronger dependence on technology as a part of the regular day. And I wanted to get your thoughts, or the group's thoughts, around how we manage privacy in these cases as well, right? Because I'm coming off of this last session, which was just fantastic, talking about inclusive design and what that means, and then starting to think, well, how, even if we design things to be inclusive, how do we move towards inclusive use in a way that supports need for privacy and retaining that sense of control, or perceived sense of control of when to engage, when not to engage.
Mm-hmm. So I'll start off, but I certainly open it up to other folks here who can bring in their own experience and expertise on that as you'd like. I think one of the pieces around that, Kath, it's a really good question around the more we utilize these types of things and forgive the word, normalize the use of them, the less they become an othering and identifying experience. So that's one area where we can, because sometimes to use something means to disclose, or to access something means to disclose, and it's tough to actually pull that apart. Whereas if that's accessed by many people with lived experience, allies, it becomes a more, I'm trying to think about, the fact that I'm using something assistive right now. Most people don't even notice that anymore, right? They don't see it as an assistive thing. So I'm not necessarily feeling at the same level of revealing something private about myself. But as you've said, certainly some technologies as well do require or can can break privacy, even when we're talking about just general discussions and chats. Something I've noticed is when I'm facilitating things, there are times where people will resonate with something, they will put it on the chat, and it's actually, they're disclosing something about a family member. And I sometimes wonder, oh, does your family member know that? Right? So even those, so I think that brings me to my second point, is how we start to learn to engage with these new types of supports and systems for ourselves. Because I would say one thing during the shift in COVID is that when you looked at learners, right, how to use Zoom, or whether it was Big Blue Button or whichever platform you were using, even for kids, like for people with attention challenges, we're not used to looking at all of our peers while we're learning. So knowing that, oh, I could take it off gallery if I had a challenge with being distracted by things, or how can I use this functionally for myself to individualize it for myself? So the more we get kind of used to utilizing these types of things, I think they also become a little easier to navigate without the challenges of privacy. Now, that being said, there's all sorts of other privacy issues, as we know. So I open it up to other people to kind of talk about that. And if you're thinking, Kathy, of a particular type of example, that might be helpful too.
I'm sure if it helps
Yeah.
with the discussion. So one of the situations I've come into is I benefit from having access to live transcript, right? And so we'll say in Zoom, for instance. And this helps me with my executive functioning, my memory, my recall. There are times when I participate where that is turned off, in terms of you can't, or you can't save it, or I have to identify that I need it and why I need it. Because rightly so, it's if people aren't aware of how you turn off identifying information in the technology, technically I could be in a Zoom call with, say, even, the president of Carleton, and perhaps he's sharing something in the course of a meeting, and I download the transcript, and now I have it, and it says, his name with his words. And I think there are valid reasons why, when we're trying to build inclusion and trust and openness, why there needs to be, I guess, a common playground or a common set of playground rules, or those types of things. But I think in absence of that, I think there's a lot more of a cultural change and adjustment that we're just hitting the tip of. It's just my thoughts on it.
You're absolutely right. And if we go back in a few years, and it still sometimes occurs, even when students are asking to record a lecture, right? And there are times where people say, I don't, I'm worried about being recorded, or, what are the parameters of this? Will this be YouTubed later? Those kinds of questions come up. And so I think you bring up the point too. Well, 2 points. One is universally designed and as used as widely as possible, we can get things, then we do remove some of the layers of where people have to ask and request. Right. But in addition to that, is having these conversations would be very important, so that people understand why they're being used, how they're being used, and that we actually have conversations about the expectations of the use, because they're fair. There's fair questions on all sides, and it's when we leave it to silence and assumptions that we tend to find these systems getting far more othering and non-inclusive in a sense. I don't know if anyone else has something to say on that, but I'm also happy to take an additional question, and we can just kind of go back and forth.
Yeah, for sure, Tara. Rebecca has her monitor on and her hand up. So Rebecca.
Hi, my name is Rebecca, and I am a white cisgender woman, and my hair is back in a bun, as it generally tends to be. I have a really interesting question that might be a little bit too devil pokey, but I have a really interesting thought about how do we bridge the gap between the big sigh of relief of quote unquote, I'm making air quotes, normalcy, and maintaining this beautiful level of forward motion towards accessibility and inclusivity.
Can I ask you, Rebecca, to say a little bit more about where you're locating that question? Because I do understand it for sure, and I can respond to some of that, and I want to engage with you on it. But when you're talking about moving accessibility forward, are you talking about also keeping identity intact and keeping the valuing of things so that we're not talking about simply integrating into quote unquote normalcy? Or are you talking about as we shift back into post pandemic type situation, how do we keep accessibility in mind?
Yeah, that's what I'm talking
Okay.
about more. So
Okay.
I have a lot of friends in the States and they're already heading back to work. They've already got their masks off. They're already in that situation. And so I'm really curious how we make that shift where everyone isn't just taking that big breath, oh, we're back to quote unquote normal now, and that we don't forget everything that we've learned in this past year.
Yeah. And you are echoing what some people had put in response to our survey questions here as well too. The concern that while there have been some gains made around people understanding, you know, that awareness won't actually evolve into action, or that you know, the idea of a hybrid work environment too. It isn't right now. We've got most people online, and if we go with an assumption that most people will be back to work, then essentially someone joining from home is going to seem quote unquote out of place. Whereas if we approach it with, we're a hybrid environment now, it's never going back to quote unquote normal, as you've said, and that this is actually an opportunity to have those discussions around how do we express and say what it is we all need to thrive. Because we are in a time right now where I would suggest never in my particular lifetime has there been more of an opportunity for people to be real and raw about where they are at. And that's what from disability community we've been saying for many years, is that the chance to be able to have these discussions and it be completely normed, that everyone is going to need an accommodation at some point. Everyone is going to need adaptation at some point. Everyone wants and needs to be included all the time. That those things now we can start having those discussions and drawing people in, whereas before it was almost a little bit more contrived when people would try and say let's talk about what we need, right? But then you'd have a table of folks who mostly are not saying what they need, and one person who's really in the situation where they either must divulge because they don't have a choice, right? Or must brave the setting and the potential of stigma and all of those other concerns to state what they require to thrive. So I would suggest to you that's one way. It's not the only way, but to start actually really continuing to push these conversations about wellness and about our health and about how we thrive and how we do work together and how we include many perspectives, all those facets of a diamond. Perfect. I don't know. What do you think about that? Because it's your interesting question.
I think it's really important. I think as employees, I think as students as well, I think we have to be very vocal right now about what did work for us and what would continue to work for us. I think we are at that sort of precipice of standing for what worked so that we don't just fall back into complacency.
Mm-hmm. I think you also bring up a really important point about representation, right? And so there's the idea of us being in community together and paying attention to what we all need to thrive, but also coming at it from an individual, and that as one individual, I do not represent all others. Right. And that has been in the past a real challenging thing where, particularly in workplaces where well-intentioned, there's a desire to be more accessible, and yet we'll put someone in the place of being the educator. Please educate us on what accessibility is going to mean. Please speak for all folks with disabilities. That's obviously not the way it works, and that undermines. And also it assumes that everybody is in the same place and has the same connection to a certain type of advocacy, right? And so when we prioritize or privilege a certain type of advocacy, meaning you're willing to stand up at a meeting, if that's the only way advocacy can happen in a group, then not everybody's going to advocate, because not everyone's comfortable doing it that way. So making sure we have many, many mechanisms to have these conversations, I think would be extremely important. That even from the idea of inclusive leadership, that means managers are checking in. That's also with this virtual environment. It's tough to check in. It's tough to see how people are doing. And but it's becoming all the more important, I would suggest.
I agree. Oh,
yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. That's great, Rebecca.
Of course, thank you.
All right, I have two questions. We'll go with this one from Boris first. It says, I'm personally curious about the role of technology in a hybrid, things just moved for me, sorry, in a hybrid model of school and work. Hybrid, whatever that ends up meaning, is looking like a major first step post-pandemic for employment and education. What are the issues to consider when trying to envision and transition from full-on remote to hybrid work and school, and what role does technology play in all of that?
I'll give it a start, and I'm sure there's others who would want to, put your name in the chat if you want to answer this one as well too. And Julie will see that you're wanting to respond to Boris on this one. Boris, I would suggest a few things are, one, that there needs to be a really good research of what technology is going to fit with that workplace to make sure that it is a seamless return, in the sense that it's not going to be everyone's just back at a workstation in a terminal, right? So, and that's, I'm thinking of a certain type of workplace right now too. This doesn't apply to all settings, but what does it mean to have that seamless, so that it's not the one person trying to access from home and the technology never works, and then finally everyone just goes on with the meeting and we'll catch you up later. Sorry, it's not working well today. That's not going to cut it anymore. So there really has to be a paying attention to that technology being seamless and working well. And I think it has to be a bit of a review. Workplaces are going to have to understand their own culture, right? So if you're a workplace where a lot of conversations are happening at the quote unquote water cooler, I don't know how many workplaces continue to have water coolers, but then you're going to need to think about assistive tech that helps people engage in those more organic times. And I think that's an important piece too. So that's one level I would suggest.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other comments in response to that, Tara, but
I can tell you a few things that other people said about technology then, Boris, a little bit more to your point on that one, which is the idea of, let me just find the note that I saw. So one was, someone did talk actually about when return to work occurs, it's also a really good opportunity to be looking at some of those other physical environment related barriers, such as the types of lighting and the navigating the areas, all of those sort of physical pieces that people assumed have already been attended to, but it is an opportunity to now make some of those tweaks as everyone's potentially coming back into a workplace. And then the idea too of providing access to assistive technology. So for instance, I don't know who wrote this in, but I do know, for instance, the idea at one of the colleges where Read and Write Gold is available to everybody. You don't have to go to an assistive tech. There's a license for it to be used by everybody. So the next step they'd like to take is being able to provide many of the assistive technologies anywhere on campus, and then remote access, because they have it on campus now, but providing that for remote access. The challenge to that is licenses, and also being able to know that the remote access solution is actually compatible with the functionality remotely. So like those are some very technical pieces that will have to be ironed out, and they're not easy right now. And so it's something that'll have to be thought about.
So Tara, two questions, and they sort of play on each other from two different people. So one of them says, as allies, how might we co-create learning and training that ease the burden on people with disabilities and others for knowing what options there are in using tech to make work life better. And I'm just going to share the second part of that question that ties into it. That was a good point. And how do we train educators to feel prepared? I'm an instructor and I don't, for having these conversations and for creating safe learning spaces for all.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Well, I think, one of the first foundational principles of that is making sure that any content that's developed really is informed by folks who are using these things and may have these needs and can share. Like, so even something like Enable Ottawa, where like for just going through these notes, I realized for myself that there's a few things I should be using with things that I'm struggling with at work right now, or in terms of capturing notes or things that I can refer back to. So I've noted them down for myself. So these continued shared learning environments, like the knowledge exchange piece, I think is actually a really important way. And if we can capture those and share them widely, that's helpful as well. But creating that into some professional development, I think, is going to be absolutely critical, because now we have, if we want to push for this to be utilized fairly universally, that means we have to skill up. We have to learn about it. So I think the development of that would certainly have to include folks who can inform it. And then perhaps we start leveraging some of those networks we have, whether that's through our learning services. So not keeping that just in the realm of the assistive tech or, accessibility services, but actually pushing that out across a campus, across an employment environment to say, everybody needs to know about these things. They're super useful. They're very helpful. What you don't want to do is say that this is the list and these are the only ones we can use, because what you want in terms of inclusive leadership is to be giving the messaging out that, for instance, accommodation is a conversation. And so to state, hey, this is helpful for me, this has worked in the past, can we have a conversation about that? As opposed to people saying, okay, I've got it now. This person's definitely gonna have to use JAWS. Making those assumptions is also, I think there's a whole other level of co-creation of learning where we support people to have these conversations. And it begins with saying, what's working for you? What do you think you might need? How can I support as well? Because people, and being open to have some pauses and some I don't knows. That's okay as well, as long as we're continuing the conversation and we know what we're moving towards, which is someone thriving in their environment.
All right, I'm not seeing any other comments or, oh, I do, sorry, here's one. Ainsley has an observation. This makes me think that we all need to rebuild our procurement processes with all goods and services, but specifically, I'm calling out technology here, including people with disabilities in the procurement process early.
Absolutely. Who decides what is accessible and decides what to buy? Exactly. And certainly we know that there are different situations where people will say, well, I could use this. And a company says, sorry, we don't use that one. There's an issue with privacy, or our platform won't support that, or whatever that is. And yet then the conversation ends. And that's not where we want to be in terms of having an inclusive environment. It's about saying what's worked and also questioning why it is we can't. Can we remove some of the limits and the bureaucracies and the pieces that are at play that stop us from, in terms of what you're talking about, is the procurement process. There's certainly a lot of places where we can look in procurement to sort of make some tweaks around that. I think there's other parts in the chat that I just saw come up for me too.
Yeah. So there's a good comment.
Can you read them out for us?
Yeah, for sure. So I think we captured this one. Who decides what is accessible and decides what to buy? And then both for work and less on the radar in the schools. And how many people ask students themselves about what works for them?
Yeah. And I think that's an essential first part of training, is to understand that we really need to be, anyone who's in a supportive role needs to be asking, what's working, what has worked. And so it's not to go into a conversation expecting someone will know immediately what is going to work for them, because it's very possible if I'm showing up and I have a newly emerged, something that's occurring for me that I actually have never had before, then I may not know what's going to work best for me. Or on the other end, I may have been dealing with this since I was a child and know exactly what's going to work for me very well. So creating space for those conversations are essential. And I would suggest that often there's not space in workplaces for conversations. And that's a challenge, because that's when people start relying on check boxes, and or out of fear that something will create more work, they don't ask the questions, they don't engage in the conversation. And that can occur on both sides. It can occur for folks who are afraid or worried to ask that something might create more work and therefore will reflect poorly on them, or there will be stigma related to that. Or it might be on, say, a leadership side or a manager's side where they're afraid to suggest things are outside the box too, because that could create a whole bunch of things that they don't feel comfortable working within. So certainly some of the work in READ, we know that many environments suggest that a go-to person or a resource where they can start to bounce these ideas off of someone who has some expertise and understands the environment could be really helpful. Because to your question, Ainsley, who decides? It depends on organizations. Sometimes there's a one point for decision. Sometimes it's really about the person that is just your direct supervisor, or it might be in the case of an HR group. So it can vary, and that can be very confusing and difficult. So what we need to do is make sure that in terms of leadership, the person that an employee can speak to has a confidence and a comfort with starting the conversation. So then together we can look around and say, okay, how do we find a solution? Where do we look? You know what you know, I know what I know. Let's go and find out what needs to happen.
So we just had a great comment from Rebecca. She just said, and just think about how much more success it could lead to if we started asking students what works for them, or even better, how it could lead to the beginning of learning how to self-advocate. Yeah. All right. I'm not seeing anything else happening here in the chat for comments or questions. We do one last round. If there's anybody else, feel free to raise your hand or put in the comment.
I appreciate all the reflections that people have been having about this stuff, because, well, certainly, I can geek out about talking about this. So I think it's a really neat way to wrap up some of the considerations. There's been some fantastic panelists and learnings over the last couple of days. So it's a neat way to be able to just start reflecting on these things.
Indeed. Well, I think with that, Tara, we will wrap up this session. And I'm realizing that I hadn't officially acknowledged myself or described myself for those who are attending. So my name is Julie, and I am a Caucasian female, and I am in my home office when I'm surrounded by books and learning and artwork that I've done with my daughter, and motivational signs that keep me inspired every day from working at home. It's been a real honor to be here today, and I have the great pleasure of wrapping up Enable Ottawa. And so I can't help but reflect on the events of the past year. A year ago, we were really at the beginning of this global pandemic, and we recognized how much our lives have really been impacted and forever changed, and recognize that assistive and adaptive technologies will play an ever increasingly important role in creating a truly inclusive and accessible world. We're really actually thankful that these technologies allow us to not only just stay connected with our allies and our partners and our collaborators and our colleagues, but that there's new designs and new technologies that are allowing us to engage, to create, to design, and to inform the ever-changing world that we live in. And we're most thankful to each of you for taking part in the events over the last couple of days. I know many of you have been here with us from the start on Tuesday when we launched at 12:30ish, 1 o'clock. And so thank you for taking the time to be with us here over the last few days. The speakers who participated in this forum represent a wide range of experience and perspective in the assistive and adaptive technology and design sectors, as well as those who are using technologies to help redefine experiences for all people. But the underlying notions of inclusivity, universality, nothing about us without us, and intentionality of process and design have definitely been underlying common themes for everyone in the different sessions that I've been following anyways. On Tuesday, when we opened, our Vice President, Students and Enrollment, Suzanne Blanchard, mentioned in her opening remarks that Carleton University prides itself on continuing its commitment to build on a culture of inclusivity and accessibility, not only through its research and programming, but by hosting forums such as Enable Ottawa, and ensuring that we continue to showcase best practices in collaborative settings, that students are supported and developed, and that the skills are critical for success in this increasingly digital economy and world that we face ourselves in. So with all of that in mind and so much information, and honestly, I'm so grateful that we have these sessions recorded, because there's a few that I would love to just go back and percolate on, and I'm sure some of you feel the same way. But we really wouldn't have had these sessions if it wasn't for a few key people. And I would really like to take this moment to thank the organizers and our planning committee for this event, the READ Initiative at Carleton University and the Faculty of Engineering, and many of these people that I'm going to name right now are here on the screen. So if you want to turn your cameras on and do a shout out and a wave, and just to show our appreciation for a great week of events. The City of Ottawa, the Ottawa chapter of Tetra Society of North America, March of Dimes Canada, Neil Fire Society, IL Canada. So many of our partners have just been integral in creating the programming and identifying speakers to participate. And it's just been a really powerful conference for the last 3 days. I would also like to thank AI Media, their world-class leaders in translation and captioning, who are generously providing captioning for the online forum for the last 3 days, and to the City of Ottawa for their financial support that has allowed us to include ASL translation as part of our services for the support this year. I would be remiss in not thanking and acknowledging the time and support of our many speakers that have taken time from their busy schedules to participate in this knowledge exchange forum. And finally, I would like to thank our event coordinator and this year's MC, Moira McGrath from the READ Initiative, and her team working behind the scenes. Heather Sharp from Sherpa Group, our student team, Rebecca, Zion, and Stan on tech and social media duty, Carleton Educational Services helping with our recording and our logistics of technology, Feedloop as our platform provider and super user, and of course our ASL translation teams. This event would literally not have happened without all of you. So thank you so much. So excited to have you all here. We wish you the very best, and we look forward to reconvening again in spring 2022. And with any luck, we will hopefully be able to be hosting a hybrid model of this event with a mix of in-person and virtually offered sessions. So with that, I will officially call Enable Ottawa to an end, but I do want to